Hello, everyone. My name is Payman, and I'm very pleased to be presenting this keynote talk to all of you. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me and for going into all the trouble of making sure the conference happens at all under the present circumstances. I know it hasn't been easy for anyone, but organizing a thing at this scale is difficult, especially virtually. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So today I would like to speak to you about computational photography. In particular, I want to trace out a history, and hopefully this will be entertaining from two completely different perspectives. One is that I hope to give you a historical perspective on computational imaging and how it has made it into mobile phones. And second is I want to give you some technical details about some of the aspects of the technology that I have been fortunate to be involved in both as an academic and also for the last 8 years at Google. Okay, so how the mobile phone became a camera. As I'm sure you would agree, the smartphone has really changed the world. In fact, the smartphone is really more of a camera than it is a phone nowadays. And there's plenty of evidence for this all over if you look a little bit carefully. In fact, the idea has become so obvious that we don't even think about it anymore. From an economic standpoint, a $1 trillion smartphone economy has spawned, and but that's not all. It has also fundamentally changed the way we interact with the world. Here's a piece of evidence you might find interesting. This is a picture from 2005, the Vatican Square when Pope Benedict was announced. I want to draw your attention to the lower right-hand corner of this image, where you'll see one lonely individual with a flip phone taking a picture of the scene. Now let's fast forward just a few years to 2013 when the next Pope, Pope Francis, was announced. And here you'll see that virtually everyone has a mobile device, everything from tablets to phones, taking a picture of the scene. And this is a fundamental transformation in the way we remember our world, we capture our world, and so on. In fact, smartphones have caused a photography boom. It used to be that you would have to buy an actual camera to photograph things, but nowadays, 85%, this is from 2017, so it's probably closer to 90% now, of all the photos taken in the world are taken on smartphones. Only about 10% are on digital cameras. And to put some numbers on it, more than 2 billion photos are shared on social media per day, which is kind of an astonishing number. And 100 million of those are selfies. Think about what that says about our world. Okay, so I mentioned a little bit about the camera industry being very negatively impacted by this. And in fact, here's a picture where you can see that. The blue columns here indicate cameras built with built-in lenses, and the red is cameras with interchangeable lenses. And so put them together, and these are cameras that are not phones. And if you look at the market, it sort of peaked around 2010 and collapsed. In fact, it has collapsed by about 85% since 2010. So the history. There is a lot of history, of course. The photography dates back to the 1800s, and I'm not going to go through a lot of the details. And there's a very, very rich history here as well. So I'm going to call that old school and move on. Then there's the era of analog photography, which I'm going to say just one slide about that. Then digital photography spans the 90s. And finally, in the 2010s, I would say, critically, starting in 2010, the era of mobile and computational photography really has taken off. And so most of my talk will be concentrated in the section here that I have indicated in red. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about analog photography. So analog film dominated for about 50 years, and it was largely discontinued around 2005. The pioneer in this area was, of course, Kodak, but there were many other makers of the analog rolls as well. However, the digital photography is the main topic of today, and so let's talk about a little bit of a historical tour of what transpired here. The first digital camera prototype was built around 1975. In fact, there's an interesting history right there. So I want to show you what this first digital camera looked like. If you look on the left-hand side, this blue thing here is the actual casing of the camera. There is a computer underneath it that controlled it. There is a cassette tape you can see here, and this cassette tape was in fact where the photograph was recorded. The resolution was very low, 100 by 100. It took about 20 seconds to shoot a single picture. And then if you wanted to play the picture back, you would have to take this cassette tape out, put it in this other microcomputer, and then you could play back the picture on a television screen. So the inventor of this technology at Kodak, interestingly enough, was a young engineer named Steve Sasson. And when he showed a prototype of this invention to the Kodak executives, they told them that they were convinced that no one would ever want to look at their pictures on a screen. Now imagine that. We almost look at nothing but screens now when it comes to pictures. So it was a very, very different world, obviously. But I wouldn't feel too bad for Steve Sasson. It's not like he's a forgotten inventor. He was, in fact, recognized for his efforts. 35 years later, he received the National Medal of Technology in 2009. Now, moving forward, the next, actually, let me say a little bit more about that era. It's kind of an interesting coincidence that around the same time the Polaroid camera was making its kind of round of popularity at the time. Now, if you think about what's happening in the world today with the social media, one of the things that drives all of that is instant gratification. And we have a tendency to think that instant gratification is just this very recent thing and it didn't exist before, but that's not really true. If you think back to the early days of Polaroid, that's exactly the motivation there as well. So the first digital cameras, the first commercial digital cameras, not prototypes, this took about, I don't know, maybe 20 years, 15 or 20 years to be made. And this is kind of what they look like. One of the interesting objects here to think about is this device called the Logitech Photoman. Very low resolution, black and white, kind of 256 gray levels, cost $1,000. So you wouldn't be surprised to hear that it actually didn't sell very many units. The things on the right look more like the cameras that we have today, and these had Nikon bodies and Kodak sensors. Basically, these were the first DSLRs. What's interesting is that there was solid state memory, of course, was very expensive and bulky. So if you wanted to capture photos with these cameras that had on the order of 1.5 or so megapixels, many of these cameras had to have external hard drives that were tethered to the device. So for example, here you see this huge thing. You actually had to carry it over your shoulder to take pictures. The cost was very high, around $20,000, and these devices in the very early days sold no more than 1,000 units. So they're very highly specialized things. Okay, the next kind of interesting transformation of technology was CMOS. Everything that I've talked about so far, all the cameras that were electronic were based on CCDs. And CMOS was invented in 1993. Well, I think that's when it was published. And it was quite revolutionary. These were very much cheaper devices. They were power efficient, um, but they were noisier and they had a rolling shutter readout. In fact, some of these technical limitations meant that it would take at least another 10 years before CMOS would become convenient enough and easy to produce, easy to mass produce, and affordable enough to power things like mobile and digital cameras. And of course, now they dominate. Um, Digital SLRs and compacts. So let's talk a little bit about that. So here we're talking about in the early 2000s. Thinking about this, there were sort of two sets of devices available at the time. The Canon PowerShot, as an example of the kind of point and shoot devices that were available. They cost around $500. And then the SLRs, still based on CCD technology, were 2 to 3 megapixel resolution. They had a decent amount of internal memory, so that you didn't have to have this external thing you carried around, and they cost around $3,000 to $5,000. Now, if you fast forward to today and look at the cameras, the point and shoot cameras. So let me just show you again these devices. The point and shoot were $500 or so. The early DSLRs were $3,000 to $5,000. And if you look at the devices now, prices are about the same. For the point and shoots like the Sony RX100, which is an excellent camera, and for the Nikon D810, $3,000 to $5,000. So what's interesting, what's happened is that the value has really improved. You get many more pixels, you get terrific optics, and the prices are the same. So you can think about a camera as sort of price per pixel has really gone down for the consumer. But of course, that's not what we're here to talk about. So I've spent the last 10 minutes or so talking about photography, generally speaking, but now I want to talk about mobile photography and the recent history of that. So the electronic camera with programmable transmission capability was a patent that was filed in 1997. And you might be surprised to hear that this patent was also filed by Kodak. So you've heard Kodak now many times throughout the last 12 minutes or so. Now, what's interesting is if you look at this picture here on the left-hand corner, you see that it almost looked like a modern day, or at least a mobile phone from the late 1990s. Unfortunately, Kodak didn't really follow up and pursue this technology as much as they might have. They were afraid that it would cut into their analog photography business. And so as a result, others took it over. And the first commercial camera phone, which you see up there, was in fact built in Japan. It was called the J phone. The company that made it was Sharp. It was very expensive, again, on the order of $500. And it took pictures that looked like this portrait on the left-hand side. The competing devices, which were the point and shoot cameras at the same time, were about the same price, and they took much better pictures. So again, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that these didn't really sell very well. On the other hand, the flip phones were the things that really became popular. And the first camera flip phone in the US appeared about 2 years later. And a year after that, in around 2003, the same cameras were equipped now with not only a rear-facing camera, but also with a front-facing camera. And they called it, at the time, they called it video call cameras. And this is, of course, the grandfather of the so-called selfie camera that is so ubiquitous nowadays. Okay, now this next event is really critical to what happened, and that was the introduction of the iPhone. The iPhone was introduced in 2007, and it was kind of a revolutionary device, but not for reasons that you might think. Did Apple reinvent the camera with the introduction of the iPhone? Not really. what they did is they did reinvent the phone, and they did reinvent the display and the user interface. If you look at the competing devices at the time, they had hard built keyboards. They weren't very flexible. Their displays were not very interesting. You couldn't really show pictures or any kind of rich material, rich media. Um, and so, yes, they did reinvent the phone, but not the camera. In fact, the camera was kind of an afterthought. Steve Jobs gave a really lovely and now famous 45-minute keynote during the introduction of the iPhone. And he said one single sentence about the camera. He said, on the back, the biggest thing of note is that we've got a 2-megapixel camera built right in. Um, and it's no surprise in the sense that the competition were still compact cameras, which were getting cheaper, and the quality was increasing. So yes, it was a transition point, but mobile cameras were still a little ways from becoming commonplace and high enough quality to replace a separate camera. Okay, so now what happened? How did we go from the early iPhone that didn't really have a very interesting camera on it to where we are today? That in itself is an interesting and rich piece of recent history. A couple of things that I believe happened that really facilitated this transition were um, displays and networks, high-speed networks. So during around 2010, we transitioned from 3G to 4G, and we transitioned to 300 DPI displays. So let me say a little bit about that. This, by the way, I find a fascinating illustration of the size of cameras, size of phones from the early 90s to present day, and how they shrank and they got really small and then they grew again in terms of the display. But again, around 2010, the screen resolution for these devices hit 300 DPI, which is roughly equivalent to what you would see on a laptop screen. And so what was important there was that this enabled you to not only, it enabled you to really enjoy photographs on the screen of your mobile device. And this hadn't been the case before. So this was a really important transition point where people felt like their phones' screens were rich enough for consumption of photos. Um, so the other thing that happened was that as we transitioned from 3G to 4G, the amount of time it would take to transmit an average pixel, an average image with 2 megapixels, was drastically reduced. We went from something that would take around 30 seconds, completely impractical, not really social activity, to something that would take only half a second. And so with the combination of these two factors, the large display, 300 DPI, and the sharing being so quick, what that did is it allowed devices to take pictures, consume the pictures on the device, but also immediately shared with other people who could in turn enjoy them on their device. And that kind of spurred the entire ecosystem of iPhone, and then of course the other manufacturers followed suit. So I think 2010 in this brief history was a really critical point in time where this transition happened from um, small devices with bad cameras and small screens to larger devices with very good cameras and very high resolution screens. And so this brings us to the point where we're going to talk about computational photography. And at this point, the mantra became the best camera is the one that's with you. In other words, you didn't have to take an extra camera along. And of course, if you were a purist, you would think the best camera is the one that you left at home. But for the rest of us working on this technology, we wanted to endeavor to make the devices that you already carried in your pocket for other purposes, making phone calls, sending texts, and so on. We wanted to make that the best camera so that you always had it with you and there was no need for any extra devices to carry around. So I believe this is actually a good point for me to end the first part of the talk. And I will start the second part of the talk and get a little bit more technical with this material. So we'll be back with the second part of the talk.